My husband of 25 years threw my suitcase onto the wet driveway. With an arrogant smirk, he looked down at me and said, "The $85 million is mine, Margaret. You're leaving this house with nothing." I didn't cry. I didn't scream. Instead, I picked up my bag, looked him straight in the eyes, and smiled. "You're right, Richard," I whispered. "The money is yours. But you forgot one tiny detail." He laughed, thinking I was bluffing, but as I walked away, I knew his celebration would be short-lived. He had no idea that his greed had just walked him straight into a trap of his own making. Before we get into how I turned the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Margaret, and at 55 years old, I never expected to be standing in the freezing rain, watching my life's devotion get slammed in my face. Richard stood behind the glass of our heavy oak door, looking at me like I was a bad investment he had finally managed to liquidate. There was no warmth left in his eyes, only the cold, venomous calculation of a man who believed that wealth had finally made him untouchable. Everyone in our small suburban neighborhood thought I had completely lost my mind for walking away without a public screaming match. They didn't understand the quiet calm that takes over when you finally see someone for who they truly are. As the water soaked through my coat, it's time to look back at how we got here. To look at Richard during his moments of arrogance, you would never guess where we started. We married in our late 20s, full of optimism and big dreams. Back then, Richard wasn't a multimillionaire. He was an aspiring entrepreneur with a mountain of ideas and absolutely zero financial backing. For the first 15 years of our marriage, I was the sole foundation of our household. I worked 2 demanding jobs, rushing from a corporate assistant role during the day to an evening shift at a local accounting firm, all to pay our rent and fund his endless list of failed business ventures. Whenever a project fell through and our savings account hit rock bottom, Richard would take my hands, look into my eyes, and give me the same speech. "When I make it big, Margaret, we make it big together. Your sacrifices won't be forgotten." I believed him. I willingly ruined my own credit score, maxed out my personal credit cards, and walked away from my own career advancements just to keep his professional dreams alive. But as middle age set in and hair began to thin, a bitter shift occurred. The grateful husband disappeared, replaced by a textbook narcissist. Richard began to view my presence not as a partnership, but as a dull reminder of his past failures. He treated me less like a wife and more like an unpaid, invisible housekeeper whose only job was to keep the lights on and stay out of his way. I tolerated the cold shouldering for the man I married to return. I had no idea that the moment his long-awaited ship finally came in, he would use it to run me down. It happened on a quiet Tuesday evening. The rain was drumming gently against the kitchen window while I was washing the dinner dishes, and Richard was sitting at the dining table, routinely checking his lottery tickets. Suddenly, the house went completely silent. No rustling paper, no breathing. I turned around and saw him staring at his phone, his face completely pale. He had matched every single number. $85 million. For a split second, my heart leaped. I thought of our crushing debts, our years of heavy struggle, and I smiled. Stepping toward him, even opened my mouth to congratulate him. The air in the room froze solid. Richard looked up, and the warmth I expected wasn't there. Instead, his steel eyes swept over me with a cold, terrifying calculation. It was the look of a man who had just decided he no longer needed the woman who had carried his burdens for a quarter of a century. He didn't hug me. He didn't even say a single word. He simply slid the winning ticket into his pocket, walked upstairs, and locked his study door. Within 48 hours, before the public or the Lottery Commission even knew his name, Richard had quietly hired the most aggressive, high-priced divorce attorney in the state. On Thursday evening, he walked into the living room and threw a thick manila folder onto the coffee table. He demanded I sign the separation papers immediately, pack my things, and sign a comprehensive liability waiver. He was moving fast, desperate to lock me out of his new life before I could even process the shock of our reality. The next morning, I sat in the cramped office of my trusted family lawyer, Thomas. He was reading through Richard's aggressive legal demands, his jaw tightening with every page he turned. He took off his glasses, leaned across his desk, and literally begged me to fight. "Margaret, this is a blatant ambush," he said, his voice shaking with genuine frustration. "We can contest this. We can drag him through probate court, freeze the ticket asset, and force a massive settlement. You carried this man for 25 years. You have every right to half of that jackpot." I looked out the window at the busy city street, feeling a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. I pictured a toxic, years-long courtroom battle, surrounded by greedy lawyers, public scrutiny, and a man who would gladly destroy my mental health just to keep a dollar. I didn't want to spend the next 5 years of my life drowning in bitterness. "No, Thomas," I whispered, my voice steadier than it had been in days. "I'm not going to fight him directly." Richard's legal team began using intense, relentless pressure tactics. They sent threatening notices, claiming that if I didn't sign the quick-release papers immediately, they would legally saddle me with all of our historic, crushing marital debts. They thought they were terrifying a fragile, grieving housewife into total submission. I feigned absolute defeat. I agreed to sign over every single claim to our physical estate, his various businesses, and his massive lottery winnings. In exchange, I demanded just one ironclad clause, that I be fully and permanently released from any and all joint liabilities connected to his past, present, or future endeavors. They agreed instantly, laughing at my apparent weakness. What Richard and his highly paid legal team completely overlooked in their desperate rush to cut me out was a hidden financial dynamic from our past, and it was a mistake that would cost him everything. To understand his blunder, you have to know how Richard operated. For years, he was constantly hiding his personal spending and failed hobby expenses from me. To do this without my knowledge, he had been running all of his daily transactions, cash withdrawals, and minor purchases through a dormant consulting company account we had opened nearly a decade ago. That specific company was called Vanguard Solutions, LLC. Because Richard wanted to take advantage of specialized state tax incentives and grants reserved exclusively for female-owned businesses back then, he had legally registered the entire entity solely in my name. I was the 100% legal. Richard was merely an authorized user on the corporate debit card. He used that very corporate debit card on that fateful Tuesday afternoon to buy his winning lottery ticket, completely forgetting that any asset or property purchased by a corporate entity belongs entirely to the corporation itself. When Richard forced me to sign those sweep waiver documents, his lawyers had inserted an aggressive clause stating that he would completely sever himself from all of Margaret's minor, worthless business assets to avoid being pulled into any future liabilities. By signing that paper, Richard didn't realize he was legally relinquishing his own personal claim to the purchasing entity of the ticket. He thought he was abandoning a dead business, but he had actually trapped himself. He had officially and permanently tied the $85 million prize straight to my corporate entity, leaving himself with nothing. The atmosphere inside the courthouse for the final hearing was thick with tension. Richard and his lawyer sat on their side of the polished mahogany table, practically radiating victory. Richard had a smug, insufferable grin plastered across his face, fully expecting to watch me leave with a broken spirit and an empty bank account. On my side, James Mitchell sat quietly, his worn leather briefcase resting on the floor, projecting the absolute calm of a seasoned professional who knew exactly what was about to happen. The judge reviewed the standard separation agreement and asked if both parties were ready to finalize the decree. Richard's attorney stood up with theatrical flair, announcing that his client was ready to sign, eagerly pushing the paperwork forward. That was the exact moment James Mitchell stood up, calmly raising his hand. "Your Honor, before any signatures are finalized, we have an essential cross-petition regarding the true legal ownership of the $85 million lottery asset." Richard laughed out loud in the courtroom, shaking his head at what he assumed was a desperate, pathetic bluff. But his laughter died instantly when Mitchell presented the certified bank transaction tracing reports and the signed Vanguard Solutions LLC registration deeds. The judge took the documents, reviewing them with sharp, intense focus. As the realization swept through the room, I watched the physical color completely drain from the face of Richard's high-priced attorney. He went entirely pale, his hands trembling as he stared at the paperwork. He leaned over and whispered frantically into Richard's ear, explaining the catastrophic legal reality. Richard's confident smirk vanished, replaced by an expression of sheer, unadulterated horror. He had legally signed away his fortune. 3 months later, I officially claimed the $85 million and moved to a charming cottage in Carmel, overlooking the vast Pacific Ocean. The cottage cost me a little over $1 million in cash, leaving me with more wealth than I could ever spend in several lifetimes. I received word through my legal team that Richard was forced to sell our heavily mortgaged suburban house just to cover his mountain of historic debts and skyrocketing legal fees. He is currently living in a cramped studio apartment, working a stressful retail job he absolutely hates, bitter about the fortune that slipped right through his fingers. Sometimes, usually in the quiet evenings when the cool ocean fog rolls in over my front garden, I look out at the water and smile. I feel a profound sense of peace knowing that justice was served, not through loud arguments or petty hatred, but through the simple consequences of a greedy man's own reckless actions. I've used a portion of my winnings to establish a local foundation that provides comprehensive legal aid and financial education to women facing economic exploitation, ensuring they never feel powerless. Now, I'm incredibly curious about all of you who have listened to my journey today. What would you have done if you found yourself standing in my exact shoes at 55 years old? Would you have stayed and fought him in court, or would you have let the go and let me know your city? Meanwhile, I'm leaving 2 other incredible stories on the final screen.